Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Cornett. Welcome to our first episode of HR at the Table, where this podcast-style webinar series with HR and talent acquisition leaders from some of America's greatest organizations. We're going to get started in just one more minute, so hang on and we'll go ahead and get going. Still have a few people joining. Well, I've got right on the time. So again, hi, hello, and welcome. I'm Ben Cornett, your host for today's interview. While we all wish that COVID was behind us, the reality is it's still part of our daily lives. When it comes to HR and talent acquisition, some major reinventions took place. This is why I'm so excited about today's podcast-style webinar on the reinvention of HR. Thank you for tuning in. In today's episode, human resource and talent acquisition professionals will learn about some of the most significant reinvention that has taken place and those that will continue to evolve. And of course, the best person to take us through that is Elizebeth Varghese. Elizebeth is the global leader of talent and HR reinvention strategy at IBM. Good afternoon, Elizebeth. How are you?
Hey, Ben. Good afternoon. It's a lovely warm day here in New York. And delighted to be here joining all of you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today, Elizebeth. And I know we talked a little bit earlier. We've got a kind of a window view of Central Park out behind you there. So definitely looks like it's a warmer than normal day in New York this time of year.
Indeed, indeed. And yeah, I do have a window cracked open actually because it's so nice. Hopefully it'll stay that way, and the cop cars and the ambulances won't come by because that's
Yeah.
very much a New York thing, as you know.
Yeah, well, awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for joining. And Elizebeth, before we go too far in today's conversation, maybe you can take just a quick moment and tell our listeners today a little bit about your role at IBM and, of course, the vast experience you bring when it comes to the concept of HR reinvention.
Sure, happy to. So I work for IBM, and I'm part of the client services organization. So I really work with client companies to help transform their HR and talent strategy. And in that role, I'm part of the talent and transformation practice, leading all our client offerings and services in the HR and talent strategy space. I also lead our market here in North America for the talent and transformation business, which is really kind of a wrap of, our Oracle SuccessFactors, Workday, consulting and outsourcing businesses. I'm also on IBM's team for Good Technology. It's a working team that really actively looks at emerging technologies and how those are applied in the correct, appropriate ways to ensure that both the outcomes and the usage of technology are on the right side of history.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And again, we're grateful to have you today. We're going to have a lot of good conversation, I think. And I just want to let our audience know before we get going too far that this is being recorded. So we'll provide you a copy of today's interview to all attendees. And also, as we go along, we are not going to have a question and answer session really at the end of the webinar. But as your questions come up, just chat them to us and we'll try to incorporate those into our conversation today. In the chat feature of GoToWebinar in your panel, user panel. So maybe let's just get to it, Elizebeth, and maybe start by taking a deep dive into what is HR reinvention exactly? What's that mean?
Sure. So, in the old days, so this is, I've been doing this work for more years than I care to count. And, back in the old days when EHR was the new thing, right? The internet was here, we were putting HR processes, enabling them, and we were transforming the HR function. We've come a long way, and, things are still, that's still happening. We're using HRIS applications. The use of the internet obviously is ubiquitous, but we've kind of reached a point, an inflection point with emerging technologies. We were actually seeing the emergence of artificial intelligence, which is, obviously it's been around for a few years now. Also emerging technologies like blockchain and quantum computing. All of this means that the very fundamentals of how HR's processes and how work gets done is changing pivotally. It's really a dramatic shift. Much more accelerated than what we've seen in the past. At the same time, we're also observing, three significant trends in business dynamics. we're seeing significant business disruption, right? So businesses are finding competition coming from different places. If you take IBM, for example, one of our biggest competitors used to be a bookseller, right? AWS was Amazon, a bookseller. So the sources of competition are coming from different places across the board. NASA's big competition was a car manufacturer and a record company, right? Tesla and Virgin Galactic were, they started as SpaceX started as a car company, and Virgin Galactic was a records label. So we are seeing that level of disruption. And then with that, the talent required to support this ongoing disruption of business is very significant. So HR as a function really needs to be an enabling body to this continuing disruption of the business by providing the talent and the skills that the business needs, and providing HR processes that are really, one, tapping into the technology, but then also providing that kind of an employee experience that really attracts the kind of talent that is digitally literate, that's required to continually be learning in order to support business outcomes. So that element of reinvention is very profound, because it requires embedding into the business, understanding the business requirements, and kind of being seamless in how HR delivers services. So that's really why we talk about this as HR reinvention.
Yeah. And I would imagine for CHROs and top organizations that are dealing with technology, they've got a pretty robust support team sometimes around that, but not always, right? So maybe within the organization, Elizabeth, where are you seeing this concept of reinvention or HR reinvention taking place the most?
Oh, that's a good question, because we're kind of seeing that, honestly, it depends a little bit on the organization, right? The truth is, though, that the pull or the presiding factor drawing out that disruption, that reinvention, is happening at the employee level, right? So you have, employees like you and me, younger folk coming out of college who are experiencing a very different, I think the screen has changed, Ben.
Yeah.
A very different employee experience than what they might have been used to in the past, right? So they're coming into the office saying, "Hey, listen, Amazon knows when I need to reorder laundry detergent. Netflix knows what kind of movies I like to watch, right? Apple knows what kind of podcasts I like to listen to on my subway ride to work. Why cannot the office or my employer, who knows everything about me, provide that same kind of customized and personalized experience?" So that expectation of the way employees collaborate, operate within the organization, connect within the organization with authenticity and transparency is really driving a lot of that reinvention that the businesses have to provide. So that's one part of it. I think the second part of it is that force of economic disruption that I touched upon briefly. That is definitely fueling this need for reinvention. It's not really a nice to have. It's become critical for survival. So we are finding those are kind of the two big forces, again, that are kind of exacerbating this shift. And then, of course, with COVID and the events of last year, I mean, candidly, I've been talking about HR reinvention. IBM's been down this path, for close to a decade, but it's really become magnified now, right? When, March 15 hit and, offices started shutting down, who were the first people CEOs were calling? They were the CHROs, right? They were saying, okay, how do I make sure this people are working from home? How do I keep people safe? So it really kind of came under spotlight, I think, then.
Right. And we're kind of seeing that, as organizations not familiar with that, work remotely and some of the other challenges we were faced. So definitely COVID had an impact. Maybe before we go much further down the path of like HR reinvention and some of the AI and blockchain and machine learning and quantum computing that you mentioned, let's just ask our audience a poll real quick, Elizabeth. And I'm going to read this and then we'll go ahead and pop this poll question up in just a moment. But for our audience, take a moment. We're going to go ahead and start this poll. What are you using where are you using artificial intelligence and machine learning in your hiring process? If we can go ahead and get that poll started, let's see what we get. There we go. Take a moment if you can, please. And again, where are you using artificial intelligence and machine learning in your hire process? Is it in the design of the job description, job board posting? Are you not using it at all? Candidate onboarding? maybe all those three, and maybe you don't, again, use it at all. So take a moment. We'll leave this open just for another second here. Elizabeth, you've got a lot of experience, a lot of years in the space. If you were to guess what our audience is going to say is where I use AI and machine learning the most in the hiring process, is it any of these, or is it something completely different?
I have to confess, I think what we've observed is that there's a lot happening around the candidate screening and verification,
Mm-hmm.
and we are definitely seeing that that's been kind of the areas, one of the first areas to adopt AI and machine learning. We're kind of seeing it, increasingly though across talent acquisition. We are definitely seeing more and more AI and machine learning. Now, the interesting thing is though that we are also observing, and we've seen that there is a significant variation in the quality of AI, which has huge implications on the outcomes. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly like I think the audience is saying 16, that's where they're seeing most of it.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting. I know for our audience, most of the organizations that registered are larger employers across the US and of course around the globe. Is it any surprise that there's a large percent that don't use AI at all or machine learning? Is that a surprise to you, Elizabeth?
Honestly, it's not. We actually have seen, I would say, varying adoption. We are actually seeing quite a bit of adoption in the emerging markets. But I think folks are also becoming more cognizant about how important it is to have the right kind of AI, and how critical it is to have kind of that enabling ecosystem to ensure that whatever you're doing with machine learning and AI is kind of contextualized and supported by absolutely accurate data, by
Mm-hmm.
well developed AI and well written algorithms, because the outcomes can vary significantly. And then the organization itself is kind of prepared to accept this inflow of resumes, for example, right, that could be enhanced through AI or other. So those, I think, are mitigating factors in adoption, because as people and companies have become educated about these factors, they're realizing it's not about bolting in or slapping on technology on top of a process that wasn't great to begin with. So it's making
Mm-hmm.
them more thoughtful too. So I think that's slowing things down, but for good reason.
Sure, sure. I find it's really interesting, and you're right. The idea of AI machine learning, it really does need good data sets, and more organizations are getting there, but it's still a process of development, I think. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely. And so for example, like we've seen over the years, once the job boards and all of them became common, organizations are deluged by resumes, right? They're coming over the transom, like you see in the current movies, right? From
yeah.
every channel, paper, not fax anymore as much. And so, the application of technology was good, but then you were the receiving end of all this information with no mechanism to stack and read and rank and make sense of it. And that actually resulted in worse outcomes from a process perspective, right? So I think that's we've kind of crossed the Rubicon on understanding some of those things. We're actually talking to some very large organizations, and as they're thinking about AI, they're all super cognizant of knowing or thinking through the process implications and the organizational implications, right? So if I put this technology in, who's actually going to be checking on it, testing it, who's going to be maintaining it, who's going to be taking the outcomes of any process changes, and how do I make sure the HR organization has the skills and capabilities to support it? So I think those discussions are all, again, supporting, but also kind of not so much filtering as much as, pivoting the conversation a little bit.
Yeah, that's kind of leading into my next question, is, how are HR and talent acquisition leaders responding to this new idea of this technology that maybe, I think a lot of people don't fully understand. If you had any experience where, how people can adapt to that and understand it in a way that they can digest it and apply, what that kind of technology can provide for the organization?
That, so yes, so people are struggling to make sense of it. This is absolutely the truth. And irrespective of the industry, the geographical location, the size of the company,
Hmm.
HR organizations are kind of trying to wrap their heads around what can AI really do for me? I've implemented an HRIS system, but is AI really going to be significantly incremental? So they are grappling with that. So you're absolutely right. In terms of trying to, and then I think the other thing that kind of complicates it a little bit is that there is a preponderance of there's so many companies developing applications, so many companies that can do machine learning, right? So it's kind of a bit of there's lots of noise in the market, so it's challenging to sift through all of that, figure out what makes sense, what to use. So nobody's alone in that dilemma. It's very, very common, irrespective of the size or sophistication of the organization. That said, I think the companies that are really trying to do something with this technology, they're not the early adopters. The early adopters are already kind of working on it. It's just that if you think about that, the typical curve of adoption of technology, right? It's just that the bridge to the mass market adoption, I think, is a little stretched out, right? So the folks who are kind of in that stage, though, the way they're trying to learn is to actually talk to organizations who've done it, right, at scale. So I work at IBM, and IBM HR. So this is as HR function has been applying AI in our processes for many, many years. So our HR organization would often talk to their peer organizations, show them what we've done internally, and that's so seeing how AI has actually been applied in HR, in talent acquisition, talent development, compensation, has definitely helped business leaders kind of understand the potential.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And as you think about that, maybe are there some good resources if I'm a CHRO, or I'm trying to understand the idea of how maybe blockchain and that applies to maybe skill validation or some other technology. Where are there some resources that you might recommend someone like me as a CHRO go and learn about that to get more comfortable with the concept?
Absolutely. There's quite a few different things I can point you to, and of course the one that comes to mind for me, because we just wrapped this, I think the screen's changed again. We just wrapped this up at IBM. We launched a study on HR 3.0, which actually talks about the journey of the HR function from 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, where we're implementing AI and technology at scale for ourselves. And we partnered with Josh Burst. And so that report's actually out there on the website. So, I'm happy to talk to anyone who wants to hear more about it for sure. So that's definitely, one part of it. And, there's quite a bit of thinking and writing done in the space of application of AI in HR and blockchain in HR. So I have a few things I'm happy to share with you. So, definitely we can put a few things together.
Share that out. Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you. So, as you think about this whole idea of digital transformation and this reinvention of HR, what has been the hardest part about helping, everyone in the HR talent acquisition organization catch the vision?
That's a good one. It kind of takes me a little, back in time, right? So you'll have to bear with me for a second here. But, back in the day when the internet was, starting to emerge, right? People were, we were hesitant to, put our credit card numbers out there to, buy something on the internet, right? So there was this perception of fear of security around, what's going to happen with my data? Right? Is this really the right thing to do? Am I being, is this risky business, right? So there was definitely that perception of not really knowing. Part of it was because it was early days, right?
Sure.
So if you think about that, there is not really understanding what technology can do for HR, and then there is a fear, a valid fear of what could happen if you do adopt it. Now, the validity aspect of it, is something to consider, because we have found that as AI has become more ubiquitous outside of HR, I think everyone's read the articles and the research reports on kind of the ill effects of badly constructed AI algorithms, right? The effects can be quite devastating, for organizations from a liability perspective or in terms of business outcomes, right? If you have a badly written algorithm, it's going to give you a bad business outcome, no matter what it is. So understanding the implications of that has also, I think, made people, I would say, not so much cautious as much as more thoughtful about understanding, how much they need to learn about the technology, right? So I think those two factors are definitely in play. But because we're kind of past the early adopter stage, the organizations that are truly interested in, supporting business disruption, attracting the right kind of talent, and providing a very customized and personalized employee experience, they're the ones who are, kind of doing their due diligence, making sure they have the right data sets, the right cybersecurity, the right processes in place. So that is definitely shifting. So we are seeing an openness to adoption. We're seeing
Sure.
lots of interest, and we're also seeing much more thoughtful, careful understanding of implementation.
Yeah,
But
I have,
sorry.
yeah, I've got kind of a weird question. I like to ask some of the harder questions, but I think about that a little bit. Is there an industry outside of HR that's really pushing the envelope, if you will, for AI and being able to use some of these, machine learning, blockchain? In my mind, I'm kind of thinking about that fintech world, right? Because
Right.
financial services more, they're trying to predict fraud and some other things. Is there some one industry that you think has pushed the envelope the most to drive that widespread adoption?
So I do think there is one industry, and that is actually the space economy. So if you think about space exploration and everything that's happened in that space, lots of the innovations that we are using or we're kind of the beneficiary of did begin with some of the work that has been done in that economy. And I say that's a deliberate, choice of words in that, because that is an economy. It's not driven only by government and public markets. The commercial space economy has, become as proliferated, as we all know. So I think that's definitely one part of it in terms of early adoption, and fintech for sure, especially when you think about blockchain and the use of blockchain in, transaction processing, whether it's credit cards or, KYC, anti-money laundering laws. All of those things have been ripe for disruption and the adoption of technology.
Sure.
We're finding that when it comes to the HR function, though, everyone's kind of in the same place across industries, right? So when you think about applying AI and blockchain, in the business arena, or for the from the business process perspective, we've seen some variations. But the HR function as a whole, I think across industries, everybody is kind of in the same place. What you have are, some, bright stars of early adopters, folks who are trying to move more rapidly, because less a function of their industry and more a function of their organizational culture, their lifestyle, their life stage as a company, and their interest in really being more nimble and agile in the market.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if you had to pick out three people within the organization that, seem to have the biggest challenge, who would those three people be in that HR ecosystem?
I think one is definitely the CHRO.
Okay.
So as I said, last year, between COVID and the civil rights movement in the spring and in the summer, really put the CHRO person, man or woman, in the hot seat. But more importantly, really showed how reliant business continuity was on the HR function. So that's one. The second person who's really important in the HR ecosystem is the person in charge of HR security, cybersecurity, or HR data, and that role kind of changes a little bit. Like a chief data officer. Sometimes some organizations have those in HR. Sometimes it's the HR ops person who holds that responsibility. But that aspect of HR security, all the data that needs to be provided to remote workers. And I work with companies who, energy companies who have employees on rigs, employees who are on spacecraft, employees who are on hospital floors, right? So all of those remote people who are doing their work have to be connected with. So the HR data security person is super important. Yeah. I think the third role in HR that is really, really important, and sometimes that's played by the CHRO, but the role of HR in being the keeper of the flame, the provider of purpose, right? The provider of of alignment to the organizational mission. Sometimes it's the OD person, sometimes it's the CEO, sometimes it's the CHRO. The person who's constantly translating, what the organization stands for, who we are as a company, is becoming really one of the most pivotal roles and important roles. And all of this stuff, right? AI, all of that wraps around that individual and that message, because
Right.
employees are looking for purpose, they're looking for meaning, they're looking for connection, especially in a virtual world. So I definitely start with the more traditional roles, but that role of HR's purpose and the why in the organization, to me that seems to be like the most important role these days.
Yeah, yeah. That's really interesting. I like the idea of the keeper of the flame. I've not heard that before. So I wrote that down. I may steal that from you, Elizabeth. So thank you.
There you go, of course.
I don't know about everyone else, but here at Verified First, I love our VP of HR. He's the CHRO of our company, our organization, and really that puts that in perspective. He's the keeper of our flame. So thank
Yeah.
you. So, as we think about AI, we're going to transition a little bit here in just a moment. I know you've got a ton of great stories and experiences of your role with IBM and, all during the years of your career. Is there a time that, maybe you're most surprised from the impact that technology made?
That's a really good question. And I have to think about that for a second, because yes, there have been many moments
Right.
like that. As I said before, I've been in this space for a long time, and one of the big disruptions was the years of EHR, and we thought we were all so cool. Oh my God, we're putting HR on the internet, right? And we
Yeah.
were. It was good stuff. I think that was definitely, one pivotal moment, an inflection point. And I think the second is actually now, right, with all of this coming together. I think this is actually the moment for HR. The
Mhm.
moment for IT happened. Dot-com bubble. Definitely the financial crisis was the moment for the CFO or the risk officer. But between COVID and everything that all the events of last year have really shown that this is the year of the CHRO. And I think when I think about the way we do our work at IBM or the work I do with clients, we kind of have this little visual. I'll describe it for you. We have like cloud and AI computing and technology. I think your screen shifted again, Ben.
Yep.
Kind of in concentric circles, but in the middle of it all is the talent and the person. Humanity is at the center of it. So I think that this time has brought renewed focus on the fact that technology can do so much, AI can do so much, but it kind of has to be wrapped around the individual and what they need and care about.
Yeah. I think it's really, really exciting. You think about, at least our data shows that a lot of the CHROs and top HR leaders are probably around your and my age, right? We're somewhere in the early 40s, or
30s.
yeah, let's say that. Uh, but it's kind of interesting, that we've had the experience of going through the adoption of that EHR that you mentioned, right? And now
Right,
with COVID and everything, some of the younger people in those roles, they're getting to kind of experience that same aha moment, that same moment of going through that. Um,
right.
before we transition a little bit more to the COVID conversation, Elizabeth, HR technology and AI plays a role in kind of leveling the market, right? I know you talk
Right.
about that, and you talk a little bit about positions and power of some of your publications. Do you want to elaborate on that in case someone runs across that, just to make sure they're clear in what we mean when we talk about leveling the playing field?
Sure, sure. So, and stop me, Ben, if I'm, not taking this way, what we're hoping to hear. So,
No.
last year I was, I did a series of webcasts with leaders from different professions, and I was talking to one of my friends with the United Nations, and he's the head of the academic, work there. And he talked about the democratization of institutions through the COVID, through the pandemic, right? Because what has happened, everybody's working remotely, right? Whether you're in New York City or you're, in upstate New York, right? It doesn't really matter. What matters is your connectivity and what you bring to the conversation. By
Yeah.
that same token, it doesn't really matter whether you sit in India or in Africa or China or in London. If you can show up at the time the call set up and you have bandwidth, you're good to go, right? It's really leveled the playing field in terms of geopolitical location, right? So that's one
Hmm.
part of it. The second part of it is, it's a democratization of knowledge, right? So because we, all the universities are remote, right?
Right.
Um, Whether, without naming, any of the more well-known global brands in terms of universities or educational institutions, I mean, they all have the same constraint or platform to elicit knowledge, and they're all trying to get the best thinking in the same ways, right?
Right.
So again, you don't need a huge fund grant from some nonprofit or some agency to help you do research, right? If you have in the internet access, you're able to pull together sources of data information in ways that were unprecedented. So that democratization of expertise and knowledge has been significant and huge.
Hmm.
The third part of it is, technologies like blockchain or AI. When we've applied that into the world of learning and talent development, and we do this at IBM. We work with lots of organizations. We're really decoding for all of these reasons I talked about before. We are decoding strategy and work into skill sets, right? So
Hmm.
it doesn't really matter if I have an MBA, if all you really care about is my ability to code in Python or Java, right? So
Sure.
my degree is not as important as my skill set and my validated skill set. So, decoding the strategy of the organization into the work that needs to get done, into the skills that are required, is a very, very important and pivotal shift. Now at
Hmm.
IBM, we did this a few years ago under Ginny's leadership. We started looking at new collar jobs. New collar jobs are basically jobs where you don't need a college degree, right?
Hmm.
When I worked for a couple of firms, maybe about 5, 6 years ago, we would not hire people who didn't have a college degree.
Sure.
That was just what we did, but nobody cares about that anymore. I mean, so at IBM, for example, we have up to 15% of our employees don't have degrees. Up to 40% of them in some locations don't have college degrees, but they have validated skill sets. So that using technology to assess or validate a skill set, credentialize it, is again extremely disruptive and pivotal. But what it
Hmm.
does, I think most importantly for us as the human race is it really helps us access talent and the potential of all these unstructured talent populations around the world, around the country. Just like with the internet, we started being able to have people, sit in upstate New York and, provide call center services, right? Or in India or
Sure.
somewhere else. So it's that democratization of skill set and education, knowledge, working together is something that we've definitely seen as pivotal and important in this time. Does that answer your question, Dan?
Yeah, yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. And I think the idea of validating skill sets, that's definitely an interesting concept. And, to be able to do that and do that effectively, with so much knowledge out there, definitely you kind of need the power of that AI, blockchain, machine learning, the technology. So
Right,
makes a
right.
lot of sense. So maybe as we go, you mentioned a little bit earlier, a little bit about COVID and how that happened, or maybe I should say it's still happening. Um,
Mhm.
does HR reinvention mean something different today than it did, you know, last January?
I think so. I wish it was not still the case, and that it kind of got past that, as I think was everyone's hope. But
Yeah,
I think yes, HR reinvention does mean something very different. I mean, not so much different as much as it's kind of another flavor or layer to it, right?
sure.
With COVID, as I mentioned before, as the pandemic unfolded, there was this big shift to virtual work, right? So early on in the pandemic, the only thing that mattered was, an organization's ability to, give people a laptop, make sure they had bandwidth and they could work from home. But as the months, passed through, right, there were kind of other problems or issues or challenges that came to light. You still needed to be able to collaborate and innovate in a virtual environment. So that's one.
Hmm.
You needed to have a very different view of employee health and mental health. And then third, you needed to have a very different view of the workplace and what that really symbolizes for people and for organizations. So those three, pivots or challenges have kind of changed the flavor of HR reinvention a little bit. And I can
Mhm.
talk, go into a little bit more detail there, but let me pause there for, reactions, thoughts before we dive in.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely a good point. I think I like the idea of the flavor. It kind of brought it or created a new sense of urgency, possibly, for a lot of organizations to start making that transition or the digital transformation.
Right.
I know we talked. I know we talked a little bit earlier. I think last week, just briefly about the idea of how COVID has changed our thinking, and maybe when it comes to recruiting and hiring. Um, and then you mentioned something about career reskilling and mobility. Can you give us some example what you mean about how COVID might have changed that for us?
Sure. So, COVID exacerbated lots of the challenges I think businesses were dealing with already, right? So the business disruption, the emergence of new competitors, the rise of, talent with new expectations, right?
Hmm.
Um, so what organizations were dealing with already was a need to reskill and upskill their employee base. So as companies were, finding that they were competing with different kinds of organizations, they had to infuse their workforce with different skill sets. Now,
Sure.
for a large organization, even a small one, it's not possible to completely swap out your workforce for a new workforce with new skills, right? Um,
Right.
and the skills that were so critical, the digitally literate folks, right, the data scientists, the data poets, as some of them, are called, were
Right.
needed by every industry, right? It's not just the IBMs and the Googles who needed, the programmers. The insurance adjusters needed them, right? The retailers needed them. Blockchain experts were needed by everybody. So the point there is that as the skills that were required for success became universally uh, urgent and critical to own. Everybody was kind of racing to attract those kind of uh, people into their organizations. So in that situation, it really became important to reskill the talent you have. Right, you can't necessarily, if you need somebody with when your screen's changed again.
Yeah. Sorry, my
Um,
bad. I hit the button wrong.
no worries. So it really became important to make sure that you are taking the people you have, the talent you have, and helping them grow and helping them reskill, right? So then how do you do that? How do you really reskill? Like in the case of IBM, for example, we had 400,000 people, right? And we were
Yeah.
moving into a very cloud-based environment. How do you transform the skill base of all of those people? So that becomes then the presiding problem, right? So in that situation, what becomes really important is to decode your work or your strategy into the work, into the skill sets, that you're providing learning that is very much geared towards the new kind of work that you're providing, right? So so
Right.
it means really looking at all the learning you're providing, making sure it's aligned to these business outcomes that you're trying to achieve. But that's not enough, because it's not to just say, build it and they will come. What's most important is infusing that learning mindset into the organization. So people should want to reskill themselves, right? And then
Right.
equally importantly, you have to make it easy for them to reskill themselves. So if you're trying to say, okay, what, we're going to reskill everybody, we're going to give them, more capabilities in, data analysis, for example, right? And we're going to identify all these training courses. But the cost of those training courses, I mean, are you then going to like, how is that going to work? So the enabling mechanisms for learning and reskilling are as important as the strategic intent. It's not enough to know that your business strategy requires these things. You have to want,
Right.
make people want to do it and help them make it happen. So that's where, where we're finding that, with COVID, that's really become exacerbated because it's all remote, right? So again, the role of AI and technology in making that connection, providing those platforms, super important.
Right.
The second part of it is that when you think about internal career mobility, so again, it goes back to this point of You can't swap out your entire workforce. You have to help them reskill. But then
Correct.
what's the mechanism? What's the internal career marketplace that helps people navigate and understand what are the opportunities out there in the organization? How can I find out how to get to that point? We found, for example, that even in a large, even in a smallish organization, no matter how well intentioned the manager is, it's really hard for them to know about every open position in the organization. They can't know that, right? To know
Right.
that at the right time, know that the employee is a good fit, um, give the employee the guidance they need at the time they need it. So we've actually found that applying AI in that situation of internal career mobility, making those opportunities transparent, helping employees figure out if they're a good match for them, giving them learning roadmaps to actually move from skill set A to skill set B, which takes them from job A to job B, all become really, really critical.
Mhm.
So the role of HR in that pandemic situation where businesses have to pivot very quickly to survive, businesses have to really shift how they serve their customers. They're seeing a significant need for the application of AI and blockchain and
Sure.
other technologies.
Yeah. And then I know there's an optic, of not doing anything, right? And
Mhm.
earlier in the survey we saw 65% of people don't use AI. So how do HR leaders overcome that idea of, making that transparent to the organization what their employee opportunities are if they don't have AI? Is there any best practices?
So that is a really good point, right? Because the employee experience that AI can provide is best understood when you see it, right? I mean, you can read about it, and I'm sure people are reading about it, but seeking those examples of organizations that have done it well, organizations that have actually done it correctly, become
Mhm.
very important. Because in the absence of that, you kind of don't know what you don't know.
Sure.
Um, so, we are definitely seeing that as I talk to CHROs and CEOs and business leaders, we often show them how AI can transform the HR process and the experience. And I think in the case of many of them, it's really eye-opening because it's not something that people are that familiar with.
Yeah. Now I might butcher this name, but we have a couple questions on chat that I think are kind of related to this. So I apologize if I think it's Nishika, I think is the question. And maybe a good question, Elizabeth. What tech trends other than AI are defining HR as we move forward into 2021? Really good question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we are definitely, and I've been writing about blockchain for over 3 years now.
Hmm.
But blockchain in HR is actually going to be the next big pivotal transformational force. AI is definitely going to continue the trend. We're going to see more of the Netflix for learning approach, the
Right.
Amazon for HR processes approach, right? So that's going to happen. But blockchain is going to fundamentally pivot how skills are captured, how information about them is exchanged and codified globally. We are
Hmm.
actually working with, we were working with the previous administration, with really the US government around some of the work around the use of blockchain and skill codification. So that's something that's here to stay. We're seeing that in work with universities and certifying bodies, like there's a few that IBM is actually working with, where you can use blockchain to help certification. So that the whole process around validating the skills of a potential candidate, ensuring that their certifications are accurate, all of that is just is eliminated. So
Sure.
blockchain is we're kind of like in the early days of the internet with the blockchain,
Yeah.
but that's probably the next thing to learn and understand about.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think again, that's a really good question. Of thinking of outside of just AI. What else is there that we need to be on the front edge of? So good perspective. Another question from Aaron, maybe not quite as related, but if you think about the recruitment, we talked a lot about taking the employees and making sure they have the right skill sets that work for our organization. But
Right.
Aaron's question is, when we think about targeted recruitment to enable us not only to target specific roles we need, but to enable diversity and inclusion in the process. Any experience or any thoughts on how, technology impacts that, and maybe some best practices? Good question, Aaron.
That is an excellent question. And, I think I like the question too because it kind of addresses some of the, issues we touched upon, but also the multi-layered aspect of,
Sure.
diversity, right? So when we think about, diversity, obviously in North America, we think about from an ethnocentric perspective, right? Globally, there's slightly different view of it. And then there's also the diversity of skill sets, right?
Right.
So when you think about kind of that broad definition of diversity, and I'll touch upon all of them, right? When you think about recruiting, what that means for us is, there's two things. One is the skill sets that, we are finding are becoming critical across every industry, like I talked about, right? The digital literacy, those data scientists, those data poets, right? Those people, skills like those are new and emerging. If you think about blockchain for a second, 5 years ago, there were no colleges offering blockchain classes. Nobody was talking about,
Right.
blockchain. Right? You couldn't learn blockchain, right? So when companies were starting to use blockchain, they couldn't look for people with blockchain expertise. They had to look for adjacent skill sets. They had to make assumptions around, okay, so this person's working in Java and Python, and they have these additional skill sets that might make them good candidates for a quantum computing or a blockchain role. So understanding the diversity of skill sets and the adjacency of skill sets is actually really important for organizations who are trying to, kind of keep up with innovation. That's one part of it.
Yeah.
The second aspect of it is, diversity from a perspective of, how do we become more inclusive? How do we ensure that, all kinds of people have a level playing field in accessing opportunities? Now, AI, when used well, when constructed well, can really help with this. I think we've all heard the
Sure.
stories about facial recognition gone awry, right? But for AI in terms of helping with more inclusive hiring processes, we're finding that by applying using AI in the candidate process, for example, we're able to open the aperture and help women and minorities, for example, typically self-select out of jobs where they don't feel 110% qualified. So, unless somebody feels like, hey, I'm absolutely going to ace this job, we kind of find that people actually don't apply to them. So what we started doing is we started applying AI to matching the resume or the profile of a potential candidate and, helping them look at a whole variety of jobs that they might be a good fit for and actually explaining to them using AI how much of a fit they were. So kind of showing them the rationale for it. And what we
Right.
found is that it really helped people consider themselves as applicants for jobs that they might not have considered themselves for. And this benefits in two ways. One, it becomes a much more inclusive level playing
Sure.
field. The other thing is it actually helps us identify skill sets, for skill sets that may be scarce, hard to find, right? So you're
Right.
actually able
Right.
to kind of, so there's a duality there, and AI is a very powerful tool in leveling the playing field across the board.
Yeah. It kind of filters into the next question from Valentina is, when you think about some of the skill sets we need to deal with, machine learning, AI, and blockchain, and some of these, data security roles, there's probably a shortage in the global market. If you think about talent, how do you go about navigating that shortage? And, my assumption, Elizabeth, we're going to talk about reskilling again, maybe a little bit, but, how do you go about that?
So, there it's, it's a challenge, as I said before, right? Every company is dealing with, irrespective of industry or geo. So it's first kind of
Yeah.
recognizing that you're not alone. Now, the point in that is that also recognizing that because you're not alone, you kind of have to compete for that scarce talent, right? So it's kind of
Right.
cognizance of both those things. So what we're finding is that, as I said, in order to reskill, you have to be able to be very clear about what is it that you actually need. So I and talk to the CEO, talk to them all the time about decoding business strategy into the work that needs to get done and the skill set. So that
Yeah.
continuum, again, that's HR's job, right? So if you say, okay, I'm going to go into emerging markets, I'm just making this up, or, we're going to go after this kind of product. That's great. That's a great business strategy, but you have to translate that into the work that's required, right? And for
Hmm.
that work, what's the skill set? So once you make that shift, you might find that there are certain skills and capabilities which are required, obviously, like Valentina's question. But if you're thoughtful about it, you might also, if you take the time, realize that those are all not core skills that you need for the organization. So there may be, so there's kind of, there's two pivots, right? There's what are the skills you need, but how critical are they for you to hold within the organization? So that's where the
Sure.
gig economy part of it comes into, right? So the contingent staffing. So we're working with lots of organizations to say, okay, you need these new set of skills, but let's really look at it methodically to say which ones do you need to have employees around, which ones do you actually rent those skill sets, and how do you
Sure.
tap into a contingent labor force that can provide you those skill sets. So kind of taking both those, looking at both those axes around skills is really going to be the key to succeeding in that, that scarcity of resources.
Yeah, great comments, Elizabeth and Valentina. Great question. I kind of want to go back to Nishka and Aaron. It's thinking about other technologies. Maybe let's start another poll question, because we did some research with Aptitude Research late December, and some of the questions, and maybe we can get this poll question up on the screen, is as you think about technology, and I think AI and blockchain and everything can fit into all of these. What are some of the areas of technology you're looking to replace within the next year? And if our audience just take a moment and select some of those and where you think you might be looking to, make some changes or replace, or consider how does AI help me solve those? I'm interested in kind of seeing some results. Elizabeth, as we think about technology, as we kind of wrap up our time here together, is there any big major disruptive technology you think that's think of yourself as a CHRO or maybe even a recruiter? Is there something out there you saw in the last year that just kind of started, wow, I got to watch what these guys are doing as far as a technology platform out there?
Yeah, I think we definitely saw a lot of interest around, um, you know, talking about ATSs and CRM applications. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so not necessarily, replacement in all instances, but uh, a lot of the discussions that organizations are having are really centered around those two. I mean, and not that the others aren't, there, but uh, I think what organizations are kind of figuring is that, there's all these places they can apply energy, right? The ATS or the enhancement of the ATS is potentially one that very quickly gives them, traction or
Mm-hmm.
success. And
Yeah,
same thing with CRM. So those are the two things. Now, and I look at these poll results too, right?
sure.
I think the assessment and background screening come. I think we are definitely seeing a trend towards kind of almost rethinking them completely and fundamentally, right?
Sure.
Background screening and assessment are probably more ripe for a significant disruption. So the conversations that are happening in those two areas are actually a slightly different nature than
Mm-hmm.
ATSs and CRMs, where you have lots of mature players in the market, and folks are trying to figure out, okay, which ones, how do I enhance what I have, how do I make switches, etc.
Yeah. It's really interesting. And, you think about that process of trying to figure out what do I replace and what am I looking for? Hopefully this little interview and webinar has given them, all of our listeners some kind of a good baseline of what I need to be thinking of in my tech stack. When you think about reinventing HR, is there a process, that takes place or must take place to really reinvent HR? Are there you got to do these 10 steps or 3 steps, or is there something there that we can provide a little bit of a foundation or help for people?
That's a really great question, because you're right. There is, over the years as we've done this, some of it has been, was organic as things were emerging. But I think
Right.
there's actually a good way to do it, and there's a good sequence of activities that I would absolutely recommend. Coming off a few years of doing it in different kind of varied flavors, right? So the first thing that I would say, maybe there's 5 steps, right? So the first would be to really understand the art of the possible. What
Yeah.
can AI do for you? Right? That's the first thing. The second is really understanding what your employees and organization needs. So understanding the employee experience, understand the organizational requirements. That's really important. So using design thinking, using a multidisciplinary approach to say, how do I work with all my stakeholders to really listen deeply, to listen
Mhm.
carefully, so I know what they need. So that's the second step. So, understand the art of the possible. Um, you know, understand employee and organizational experience requirements. The third would be really understand the process and data requirements, because depending on where your process and data is, you will need a different step for, right? So if
Right.
you're already on Workday or Success Factors, you've gone through a data architecture, cleanup over the past few years, you're in a different place than an organization that's transitioning from a legacy application or is trying to integrate lots of mergers, historically that were not integrated, right?
Right.
Look at the art of the possible, the experience needs, your process and data current state, and your requirements, because that's got to really kind of need to take a hard look at things, right? And then the
Right.
fourth would be, really understanding what kind of technology stack you need. So if you think about the art of the possible and what AI can do for you, there are lots of options and players out there. And based on your organizational requirements and the state of your data, you will need probably a different tech stack. So really understanding, what is that tech stack I need? What's the business case for it? What's it going to cost, right? Is it going to be worth the ROI? Would be the fourth step. And then the fifth, and really, I think most important step is really on building that implementation roadmap, which, so even
Mhm.
if you're not, and obviously you're not going to do everything all at once, but laying out a plan, a roadmap which says, you know what, we've listened, we know what's out there, we know what our organization needs. Here's the plan to get there. And then
Yeah.
here's kind of the step-by-step business case approach that we'll apply. So I would say kind of use that 5-step approach. What's the art of the possible? What are employee and organizational experience needs? What's the status of your process and data and technology today? What is the kind of technology stack you will need to enable this experience? And then what's your implementation and transition roadmap?
Yeah.
That would be like the 5-step process
Yeah, that's a lot of value.
into that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, So in December, like I mentioned, we had an interview with Madeline Lorano from Aptitude Research, and she did a pretty interesting market study, and they found that, a lot of HR and talent acquisition leaders, they have these similar process steps down. The one step that I think I would add that seems to be missing is tracking the results and the ROI to the bottom line. Is really interesting. I don't remember the number, but I want to say it was upwards of 60%. Don't track ROI of their HR tech investment. Kind of surprising. So,
Right, and I think it's really, and just, I know we're almost there. That's really important. It's a great point then, because priorities, business priorities come and go, right? So
yeah,
what was funded today may not be funded tomorrow, but if you're tracking ROI, you have a good chance of keeping the funding going for you.
yeah, really important. Well, Elizabeth, again, I greatly appreciate your time and your expertise, and hopefully all of our audience got a lot out of today's, a little chat here. Of course, we got your information up on the screen. Hopefully we keep engaging and following us at HR at the Table, and we're really excited for, the opportunity that we had to visit together. Any last remarks as we close up today?
No, I think just keep in mind again, thank you so much, Ben. This was wonderful working with you and the Verify First team. Appreciate the opportunity. I just kind of leave all of us with, we're all HR people who work in the HR space. That comment which resonated with you, Ben. We are the keepers of the flame in terms of data integrity, the
Yeah,
mission of the organization. So, keep that in mind. We're doing good work
yeah.
here.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And I like the idea of we can be keepers of the flame. So you should write a book about that, I think. Anyway, thanks so much again, Elizabeth. For all of our audience, our listeners, this episode of At the Table with HR was brought to you by Verified First and sponsored by Workable. Verified First, we offer streamlined screen experience with the slick patented browser integration instantly over 120 HR tech platforms. Innovation provides clients an easy turnkey experience with all American top-notch client care. Again, thank you to everyone that's visited. You can find out more about Verified First at verifyfirst.com, or you can go to workable.com to learn about Workable's platform as a sponsor. Elizabeth, again, thank you so much, and have a great Friday Eve there in New York City.
Thank you so much. Take
Thank
care.
you, everyone. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.